Okay, thank you, Sonia, and thanks to UCC for the opportunity to come and talk to you this morning. It's a very brave thing to put on an IP talk so early in the day. Shame to kill everyone's will to live, but I'll try not to do that. So I'm from Enterprise Ireland, obviously, so we're interested in enterprise, and I've been told that the audience here is a mix of academics and entrepreneurs, so I've taken that into account in how I'm going to pitch what I'm going to put to you today. First of all, just to cover briefly what my objectives are, I'm not going to start by talking about open data or data even, but to try and give the big picture around intellectual property. We're all talking about innovation. What does it mean in terms of innovation, and specifically around collaboration? I'm going to just point out a few concepts around IP and collaboration and some of the possible sticking points maybe. And then I'll come to talk about Horizon 2020 and open access. So starting right at the beginning, innovation, we tend to overcomplicate it. It's simple enough. It's just about creating new solutions for existing problems. We tend to conceive two halves of that, the create side and the commercialize side. But we tend to look at it in two halves. But it's not, it's a continuum. And intellectual property is the stuff that glues those two halves together. Because without intellectual property, you wouldn't have a system to manage the information transfer between the creative side and the commercialization side. And that's really what intellectual property is all about. If we look at collaboration specifically, it gets a bit more complicated, granted, because you get into particularly where you have different communities, the academic community and the business community collaborating for mutual gain. It can appear as a process of managing what are interdependent but often diverging motivations. So this is the challenge. So what does intellectual property do for that? Well, it does it by turning what is an intangible into a piece of property and then allowing the users of that or the owner of that to assign rights. And those rights can be different. So on the create side, you have different motivations. You want to motivate creativity, you want to support creativity, and that's risky and it requires resources and so on. The other side, of course, requires resources and risk as well, but it's a different type of resource and risk. Also, the objectives are different. It's more commercial, it's profit, and so on. So by being able to assign rights to the intangible output of creativity, it gives the intellectual property gives the possibility to bridge that gap between the creative and the commercial. When we talk about intellectual property, the first word that generally pops into a person's mind is a patent. Understandably, but it's much more than that. And patents don't just start as patents; they're built up. And I'll just run briefly through. This is a process I run through with businesses that we work with. That when you're doing work, you're creating something. You need to capture it at the other end, and when you capture it, it's the intellectual property. But it doesn't start as intellectual property. You start by having a management system where you're doing your innovation. You're creating a lot of different sorts of stuff. You need processes. You need paperwork to capture that, and so that's your. This is relevant to universities or businesses, but basically you need policies, you need processes, you need templates and documents that you're going to use throughout your innovation system. You need the capacity to innovate, and that's a whole mix of things. That's your engine room, your resources, your expertise. In terms of collaboration, it's the bringing together of the academic capability and the commercial capability in a more formidable innovation engine. And those are the inputs. There's nothing that doesn't fit into those two buckets, I believe. Then when you are innovating and developing stuff, you create a lot of stuff, a lot of different sorts of stuff. Here we're talking about data. Data is an intangible. It only makes sense when it's put into a database and that in a structured format. But it comes out in a lot of different ways through experimentation results or whatever it happens to be. But you have a lot of other outputs from innovation. Engineers' notebooks, the research agreements that you execute, all of those are assets of your innovation. and need to be recognized as that. Then there's a small, I'd state small, subset of that called intellectual property. And that's where you carve out some of those intellectual assets, and you can go to the patents office and file a patent if it happens to be an invention. You can, by using the, I think I have a pointer here, do I? Yeah. By using the processes down here and managing your system, if you keep your innovations secret and they have a commercial value, then they are by definition a trade secret. So by managing your system this way, you end up with intellectual property. You don't start with intellectual property. So it's not perfect. In collaborations, it can be difficult. Everyone wants to be driving. But in my experience of this, there are a number of kind of key sources of conflict. One is, like I mentioned, poor IP management. Not stating it as much, being as clear as possible up front on how we're going to engage, what we're going to do when we create stuff. There are a lot of mistruths, half-truths, whatever you want to call them, about IP out there. It's useful to have your researchers, whoever is involved in the project, have some awareness around IP. It's not a sideshow. It's integral to the innovation. Balancing rights and rewards, that is tricky, but IP is a tool for helping you to do that. And there are diverging motivations. You've got to recognize these challenges rather, and try to address them in how you set up the project. So in terms of setting up a project, collaboration is a long-term thing. So you need to set out as many of the rules of engagement as you can from the beginning. And some of those will come from your funder in the form of the grant agreement. You need to sit down and work out what the terms of your collaboration agreements are. That's going to span the whole collaboration partnership. Then within the partnership, you have your collaboration program or programs. It can be a number of projects within a partnership. And you need paperwork around that. You need your partnership agreements. They can be bilateral, multilateral, whatever, specific to the projects. And you need maybe researcher agreements or so on. You need all of those things because it is complicated. Because what happens is you start by putting stuff in. Everybody comes to the table with something. They've got some background intellectual property. You want to put it into the project, develop off the back of that, and then generate something new. But it doesn't always come out as you put it in. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you're going to hopefully generate new intellectual property. Sometimes that new intellectual property can't be used without access to the input intellectual property, i.e. the background intellectual property. And that's non-severable. So you need to anticipate that eventuality. Sometimes it can come out as completely separate intellectual property, and you need to anticipate those eventualities. So it is complex, and the key to making it work as efficiently as possible is to sort out as much of this stuff as early as possible. This is true in terms of a startup company that's starting to develop a new product, or a very complicated multi-party collaboration project with universities and industries involved. The same principles exist. You need to try and work out what the rules of engagement are as early as possible. Another thing that sometimes causes a problem is the concept of coexisting rights. A single piece of intellectual property can have different rights attached to it, and they can exist together. For example, there's inventorship. In terms of a patent, it's very important to recognize who the inventors are. And I mean specifically the inventors, not people that want to be the inventors, but specifically the people that contributed intellectual input into the creation of the invention. This is very often the bullseye when it comes to invalidating intellectual property. If you want to try and invalidate somebody's intellectual property, try and figure out what inventor isn't named on the patent, and you're off to a good start. So that's a really important one to get right. In parallel with that, you can have publications, and the authors of publications have rights, they have moral rights to being acknowledged and cited appropriately in the use of those publications, which is obviously important in terms of an open access discussion. And then there's the ownership of it. some organization, entity, person, whatever, owns the stuff and they have the rights to use it. They're the assignee. So again, in your paperwork, you have to anticipate all of these rights and just write them down, I guess. So then getting to open access. So Martin gave a much more detailed overview of this. I'm just going to briefly touch on it just to say 3 key points. The rationale for it is that we're investing all of this money in generating all of this research output in the form of data, publications, and so on. We don't want to have to repeat it. If somebody has done an experiment, isn't it great that somebody doing another project can benefit from the data they generate in the future? So it's about not duplicating that and fostering greater collaboration. Free open access. That means that you make it freely available, you don't charge them for it. But there are limits to the freedom of what you can do with it. And it's important to bear that in mind as well, that it's not just a free-for-all, it's free to access and use within limits. And there are, so authors always retain the integrity of their work. And there are obligations going with it. It has to be put up in repositories and in a machine-readable format and so on. Martin covered that in a lot more detail than I could. In Horizon 2020, generally, this is what the plan is around the dissemination of results. You generate this mix of different types of results. You have your plans on how you're going to manage them and how you're going to disseminate them. You make decisions on, am I going to go and patent some? Am I going to publish some? Am I going to, keep some as open access data or not open access data? So this slide just summarizes all of that. I don't think there's any point in me going into it in any great detail because some of the other speakers here are much more qualified to do that. But just to state that there are a number of avenues that you can go, and your data splits out into different categories as you develop it, and there are different ways to disseminate different sorts of data that you generate or results, innovations that you generate, and they're not all mutually exclusive. They can work in parallel. And what happens if I go back to my pyramid of building up intellectual property? So at the beginning you have the model grant agreement, I think, is a good document to start with. There was a new annotated version published just at the end of March, I think, which has a lot of very useful information in it in terms of understanding how you're going to put the rules around managing the output of your development. I gave a link there to that. And you have your dissemination plan and your data management plan and so on. Those are your paperwork processes. Anyway, you will generate a lot of different sorts of data. You might choose that some of that might be undisclosed. You're not going to make all of that open access. Some of it you are going to disclose. A patent is a disclosure of data. I would argue that the patent databases are actually an open access database. They're freely available. There's a vast amount of innovation-related information in there, entirely free to learn from. You can't copy, you can't make products from it, but you absolutely can learn from it. So open access and intellectual property absolutely work hand in hand, and open access and patents work hand in hand. In fact, the word patent, I believe, comes from the Greek for open page or something like that. So the objective of a patent is to enable people to learn from previous innovations. So it's the same principle. But you will also have disclosed data, which you can disclose in terms of the data, experimental data, through a repository, or a publication, so on. So then Horizon 2020, so there are a number of rules and so on around it. I'm sure you all know it very well, but I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. But what I want to say here is that you have places to go to for guidance and support. So first of all, in the universities, there's the Technology Transfer Office. And then in Enterprise Ireland, we have a number of different organs of our organization that kind of wrap around that system We have the Horizon 2020 team. We have Knowledge Transfer Ireland, which is a relatively new section in Enterprise Ireland that's there to kind of support the technology transfer system nationally and support access by industry to it. Then there is also, we connect into Europe through the Enterprise Europe network for building relationships between companies and technology transfer across Europe. Not only Europe, actually, it's global at this point. And the European IPR Help Desk is an excellent resource for information on a lot of IP-related things. So just in terms of those resources, if you're not aware of the European IPR Help Desk, I definitely go there. There's a library of documents like these ones here that are really, really useful in terms of, just a usable working fact sheet to help you understand an aspect of IP or data management or whatever it happens to be. So I've given links to those documents there. Obviously, there are a lot more. There's a lot of reading material around this subject. And I think that's all I have to say. So thank you very much.
We've got time for a couple of questions. Anyone have any questions?
I actually have a commercialization project with Enterprise Ireland. I was writing a Marie Curie ITM proposal. I was part of the consortium. I was very much, I was confused that can I disclose those data because this is like clearly a commercialization project. Can I use that data and propose continuation of the project in more details in a Marie Curie ITM project or not in terms of IP?
Yeah, I don't know what the answer specifically is to your specific situation, but you make the decision based on what you intend to do with the data. If it's a commercialization project, intuitively I would say that there's some commercial end, that there's a business license opportunity or a startup opportunity is what you're thinking about, and in that case you want to retain the competitive advantage in some way that your data has created for you and for that business. So, as I said, I don't know the specifics of your situation, but intuitively, I would say that you don't want to make your secret sauce available to everybody else to use in that way. That would be just a guess at your situation, but I don't really know, I have to admit.
Just more generally, there's competing rights. I know the best situation is to sort it all out in advance, but what if there's issues? Who's the arbitrator later on if issues arise? Without going to court or anything, do Enterprise Ireland get involved? Or?
No. The court is the only arbitrator. You don't want to go there.
There's no.
Really? No, there isn't. No, I mean we facilitate stuff all the time, but we absolutely do not arbitrate. I mean that'll be overstepping the line, because to arbitrate you have to offer an opinion on what way it should go, and it's really your project. It's you and your partner. You have to come to an agreement that's mutually beneficial for you, whatever that happens to be, and we don't know what that is. So it'll be wrong for Enterprise Ireland or somebody else to guide you in any way. But there are arbiters in the courts, and they cost an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
So it's best to avoid that one. Yeah.
Do you provide advice at the initial stage? I know you were saying it's to get everything sorted out at the initial stage is the best plan, which makes common sense. But do you actually provide advice on how to go about how to assign the who has what rights or whatever? How to sort it out.
When you mean an early stage in a collaboration project, do we provide advice? We do through, I suppose, the Knowledge Transfer Ireland. That would be their area. So their objective is to try and systemize that as much as possible, to provide, say, template documents.
Yeah.
So, a non-disclosure agreement, you can start there. That's always a good place to start because everybody understands what that's all about. so to provide some of those tools and processes that kind of semi-standardize the thing, or at least there's something that you can start to work around, and then you build your own stuff. Again, it goes back to like the previous question. We're a public service state agency. We can't step into a commercial kind of arrangement and say, look, this is the way it should go because, whoever says. But Knowledge Transfer Ireland has been set up in recognition of the fact that it's a difficult thing to do, and a lot of companies in particular come to this for the first time with a lot of kind of, say, preconceived notions about, which aren't always well informed. And to the companies that are present, I apologize for if that comes across as being condescending or anything. It just means that businesses are very much focused. They know exactly what they want, and they know that how they need to get there. Research is a more esoteric sort of thing, and the research community lives in that environment. And matching those two mindsets is challenging, but they're both very valid mindsets. And so Knowledge Transfer Ireland is there to try and put whatever systems are possible in there as tools to help that happen.
Usually for Horizon 2020 proposals, if the proposal is successful, there's the grant agreement, which is signed with the EU, and then there's a consortium agreement, which is signed between all the partners in the project. And that sets out, there's a section of it that covers everything to do with IP, who's putting in what, who's going to generate what within the project, and how they're going to manage it afterwards. So there is help when you're signing. The coordinator manages the development of the consortium agreement once the project is successful. And there is help. Here we have OCLA and TTO provide input into whatever UCC section of the consortium agreement that deals with IP. So all the universities will have a similar system. And if there are companies involved in the project, all of that is decided before the project starts, because the consortium agreement has to be signed before the project can start. So there is help locally in institutions, either at universities or companies will have staff that's assigned to deal with the consortium agreement and who owns what and how it's going to be exploited and all that sort of stuff.
The principles are the Commission's view on open access and open data, and that the pilot they're running and their view about open access publications across all the programs around 2020. Is there any difference between their application of that to consortium kind of research they fund, and then the research they fund, the SME-led instruments and so on? They take a different approach with the more SME-specific programs within Horizon 2020 in relation to all this agenda.
Yeah, I would imagine that most of the SME stuff fits into the undisclosed box, if you like. That is commercial, if it's commercially relevant, and it's the objective of that is to bring SMEs in, to get them innovating and building their business. So again, it's like the earlier question, there's no advantage in making the effort by that company publicly accessible to all their competitors. So the options are there. How the policies cross over the different instruments, I'm not sure exactly, but in principle,
yeah.
I would say.
The SME instrument is not covered by the open data pilot.
So it isn't.
No.
Yeah.
It's
That was a much shorter answer to that.
it's the only things in the innovation, sort of the leadership pillar that are covered is the ICT and some of the NMP stuff, but not the SME industries, not the SME instruments, not covered at the moment. They are covered when they're partners in projects. So if it's an ICT project that has ICT companies, they have to. ICT is one of the areas where the open data pilot's running, but not for the specific SME instrument. Thank you.
A quick one about this assignment of IP rights from the funder. So we're seeing in the UK there's some interesting developments in terms of funders being reorganised and having a more charitable based status. And potentially starting to come into conflict with universities about things that they fund and whether they own the IP or not? Is there a sort of very clear and consistent picture from the EU funding about that the ownership is always transferred to the grant holders, as it were, the institutions?
Yeah. As far as I know.
Yeah, I'm not sure from the European point of view, to be honest.
As far as I know, the EU doesn't get involved in. They say it's up to the project. It's up to the consortium in every project to decide how they're gonna. The same way that they don't.
That's good to hear.
The same way that they don't. Even the consortium agreement, the model that we use, is proposed by the EU. But if you want to use something else, you can. They don't. All they want is that it's the making the data. Because one of the things that they've seen in previous work programs is that they financed a lot of research, but the benefit, the economic benefit, hasn't been as high as they hoped. So that's why this whole open data thing is to go from the research to the innovation bit quicker.
Yeah, and we're in the age of big data, so the technology, the means is there now to analyze data that wasn't there in the past, and there's a lot that can be learned from data that was generated for one purpose, but if you analyze that data, it can generate knowledge for other purposes as well, and that's another reason for doing it. But the emergence of what do they call it, free access or something. There's a term in the UK for it, where they give away IP that isn't being commercialized. I would guess that's a kind of a separate issue to this. Really. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.